This is our second Sunday in Lent, and again, the Old Testament reading carries the notion of covenant. Last Sunday we heard the Noah story, where following the flood, God makes a covenant, a promise, by hanging up God's bow in the sky. I will not ever again destroy the earth in that way. This is a universal covenant. The children of Israel, the people of the covenant, the patriarchs and prophets are as yet nowhere in sight in the Noah story. The promise is to all humankind. Michael Miller helped us look broadly at the flood story as well as the covenant that is embodied in Jesus' baptism. Today we turn to the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 17. We'll get one more take on covenant before we come to the end of Lent, but I won't give that away. We are in some ways familiar with the notion of covenant. It's how one becomes a member here at Assembly Mennonite Church. Long ago, when we were setting forth our understandings of this particular community of faith, we didn't just want a regular word like join. People join Kiwanis. They join book groups, fitness centers, online dating services. No, we wanted a big word, rich with biblical and theological associations. And that word is covenant. The preacher at our wedding preached a 3-part meditation on the term covenant. He explored both Old and New Testament texts on covenant and applied them to the promises that Michael and I were making that day in the midst of our faith community. My nieces and nephews got out their coloring books. Covenant. It's a big word, closely related to promise, but with even more heft. Different than contract, though overlapping in some ways. The word covenant can be used in a variety of ways. Some of the ancient Near Eastern notions describe an understanding between a sovereign and a vassal, that is to say, an unequal relationship. The sovereign promises protection or land or provision, and the vassal pledges loyalty and obedience. Other times, covenant is an understanding entered into by equals. Here's what I promise, here's what you promise. Often covenants are conditional on both parties keeping their word. A covenant of particular significance in Genesis is one where God seems to take all the responsibility on alone, promising faithfulness even if the people fail to keep their end. In all these expressions, a key understanding is that promises are to be kept. We can count on each other, and especially God, to keep the promises made. Fresh as the morning, sure as the sunrise, God always faithful, you do not change. Like many of you, we read a lot to our young children. Of course, there were favorites, the canon within the canon. Miss Rumphius probably topped the list. The sun and the wind and the runaway bunny were close behind, and somewhere up there was Cornelia Lane's 1970 Bible storybook, God Keeps His Promises. Of course, now there are inclusive language problems jumping right off the front cover, but the idea that God can be trusted, God keeps covenant, was a notion I wanted to get in there with my children. But of course, it's way more complicated than that. So with the Abrahamic covenant in mind, I'd like to be honest about some of the challenges in keeping faith with a covenant-making God. One of the websites I found in preparing for this sermon runs under the heading, The Church of Truth, whose mission is to free people of all faiths from the tyranny of their religion. The particular article I read was, God Made Promises He Did Not Keep. This website is painful reading for the literalism it applies to the text, the quoting of the King James Version, the grammatical errors, and the struggles borne by the writers and the readers of this site. Another article I found was entitled, How to Obtain the Promises of God. Equally painful reading, frankly. So how are we to think about Yahweh, a covenant-making, promise-keeping God, a God who keeps faith with us generation to generation, as the psalmist says. Well, we can come at this in two ways, the particular and the overarching. So let's look at the particular as it's presented in Genesis 17. Here the promise is essentially descendants, lots and lots of them. We could also look back to Genesis 12, where Abram is first called to leave his land and go to a new land. Again, the promise is for descendants. If we look ahead to the Mosaic and the Davidic covenant, the promise is very clearly linked to land and generational rulership over the land. Frankly, those two covenants are more problematic, especially as we've seen them played out in relation to the modern-day state of Israel and the land taken from the Palestinians in the name of the God who is faithful. But if we zoom out and look with the overarching frame, the covenant isn't so much about land. It's essentially about relationship. I will be your God, and you will be my people. I will show steadfast love and mercy. You will love me and your neighbor as yourself. Clearly, there is a special relationship here, and while it's been called exclusive, the various Old Testament writings indicate that the stranger, the sojourner, the foreigner, the widow, the orphan are always to find a place amidst this chosen people. In fact, in many places, it's clear that obedience to Yahweh and the covenant means living justly, showing mercy, walking humbly with God, as in the language of Micah. Who can fault this sort of covenant calling? The bigger challenges come when we treat this as some sort of material exchange. If we love God, God will bless us with health and wealth and children and longevity and the good life. Go a little deeper into the woods with me. Today's gospel reading from Mark 8 throws water on the material exchange view of covenant. And it doesn't come easily for Peter to hear what Jesus is saying. Keeping covenant with me will cost you your life, just as it will cost me my life. Rather than gaining material goods and protection, following after Jesus may strip you of much that looks like material success. Who would want to enter this kind of covenant? Jesus, apparently, and so too the one who sent him. Let me be clear, precious few of us have ever known this kind of costly discipleship. I know I haven't lived with persecution, oppression, grinding poverty heaped on as I cling to my faith. Yet there is a vibrant example around and near us who illustrate a trust in the faithfulness of God in the midst of suffering and the apparent failure of God to deliver on the promises. The Black Church. Here are people who continue to find hope while lamenting the lack of justice, trusting the mercy of God while taking to the streets. From the spirituals to Black gospel, the hymnody of the Black Church sings of longing and hope, confidence and trust. I watched Henry Louis Gates' The Black Church, This Is My Story, This Is My Song, last week on PBS. I found it engaging complex realities, not painting any kind of pie in the sky sort of hope. What a story of a people who testify to the faithfulness and trustworthiness of God. It's worth watching if you like Black gospel or if you're doing anti-racism work. So are there any ways that we can relate to Mark 8 and the hard teachings of Jesus? Let me offer a couple other questions that we might more readily answer situations many more of us often face. Who would want to make lifelong promises that will doubtless be tested and tried, that will limit our options and tie us down? Who would want to commit to others who will doubtless disappoint our expectations and try our patience? Yet a remarkable number of us do exactly that. We parent children. If we give ourselves fully to it, few things challenge us and break open our hearts like parenting children. One of the struggles in parenting very young children is the endless repetition of the daily round. Waken from sleep, whether restless or sound, change diaper, feed child, pat for burp, wipe spit up, attempt to settle child, collapse into bed, waken to acrid-smelling wash basket, not to mention diaper pail, and start wash. Fold yesterday's wash, now wrinkled and slightly graying, feed child, pat for burp, wipe spit up, I won't go on. Those of you who are parents of very young children know this drill inside out. It varies as the child grows, but there are years when you feel you will forever be buckling children in and out of car seats, scrounging around the house for a pair of decent mittens, wiping runny noses, picking up and putting away toys at day's end when you just want a good book or something on Netflix before you collapse into yet another night of interrupted sleep. Over and over again. No task is ever completely finished. Check. Done. Not for you. You'll do the same things tonight and tomorrow and the next day. The pandemic has been particularly difficult for parents of young children. Already living with the endless demands of young children in the best of times, parents, often single parents, are left juggling more challenges than I can imagine. I found that living alone during this time has brought considerable pain, but I think it's not as hard as parenting young children, especially in communities where daycare and schools have closed their doors. Why do this? Why give up your life in this way? Is it not the obligation of love that asks this? Day in and day out, our children ask us to dig deeper, to reach for a little more energy, a little more creativity, a little more patience than we had thought possible. Parents somehow must find meaning in doing things over and over with no certain end in sight. Does this not sound like Yahweh, the faithful God of Israel? One must find meaning and purpose in keeping the promises you made when this child came into your home, disrupting and demanding that you lay down your life as you once knew it. Does this not sound like a summons to faith? Parenting requires learning to see small changes, taking delight in incremental growth in the midst of mind-numbing sameness. It is a school for spiritual growth. You parents of infants and young children have your own in-house tutors for deepening relationship with a covenant-making, promise-keeping God. Of course, not all of us are parents, but all of us have been children. We have all in some way lived with the gifts and struggles of a covenant of love, one that at any point in time may not provide the benefits we were told to expect. As people of faith, we are bound by a covenant of love. I bind my heart this tide to the Galilean side. And we trust that in losing our lives, we will in fact gain them. We know deep in our bones that sometimes our promises are kept with gritted teeth and tight-fisted hands. Sometimes that's the best we can do. We also know those wondrous moments where there is deep joy, sometimes tapping into the companionship of goodness and mercy accompanying us all the days of our lives. That is the deeper gift of covenant. Not that we barrel through, doing what we have to do by sheer grit and determination, but that we are carried along, accompanied by one who keeps faith with us, who promises to be with us, no matter what. This love is known in the one who made covenant with a strange, small band of people millennia ago. This love is known in a God embodied in Jesus, who loved his own in the world and loved them to the end, as we read in the Gospel of John. This love is known in a God whose Spirit accompanies and surrounds us all our days, breathing in and out with our every breath. May it be so among us, individually and especially together, in this strange, small band of broken people who keep covenant even in the time of COVID.